Good afternoon. Welcome to the Getty Villa and to our annual Villa Council Presents lecture with Alicia Stallings. My name is Verena Leppe. I'm the Anissa and Paul John Bolson II Senior Curator of Antiquities and Head of the Department of Antiquities here at the Getty Villa. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all today. The annual Villa Council Presents lecture series is made possible by the general support of the Villa Council, a group of supporters of the arts who believe strongly in the mission of the Getty Villa to bring art and culture of the ancient world to a modern audience. Through the generosity of the Villa Council, this lecture and many other programs are made possible. It is now my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome and introduce our guest speaker today, Professor Alicia Stallings. Alicia Stallings is the 47th Oxford Professor of Poetry, a position founded in 1708. Yes, you heard correctly, 1708. She is only the second woman and the first non-British or Irish person to hold this position. She studied classics at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia, and resides today in Athens, Greece. A finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, her work has appeared in Best American Poetry, The Atlantic Monthly, and The New Yorker. Stallings is one of the most decorated poets of her generation. Her honors include the MacArthur Fellowship, this is the so-called Genius Grant, in 2011, the Guggenheim Fellowship, the Benjamin Dunks Award. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has recently been elected to the American Philosophical Society. She has published 4 volumes of poetry, most recently, This Afterlife, and 3 volumes of verse translation, including Lucretius' The Nature of Things, and Hesiod's Works and Days, and the pseudo-Homeric battle between the frogs and the mice. Stallings' recent book, Freeze Frame: How Poets, Painters, and Their Friends Framed the Debate Around Elgin and the Marbles of the Parthenon, from 2023, has a unique, gossipy, if I might say that, and human-centered approach to a notoriously heavy-handed cultural debate. Stallings brings a literary sensibility to a topic usually dominated by archaeologists and lawyers. Rather than a dry academic study, her book is anecdotal and character-driven. She shifts the perspective from property rights to imaginative impact. Ultimately, the book speaks not just to those interested in the controversy around the Parthenon marbles, but to anyone who enjoys seeing how art, politics, and personality intertwine over centuries. Consequently, her lecture today is entitled Poets, Painters, and the Plunder of the Parthenon, Framing the Debate over the Sculptures from the Acropolis. Lord Elgin's removal of the Parthenon sculptures at the beginning of the 19th century stirred up not only the British Parliament, but poets such as Keats, who viewed their appearance in London as a transcendent experience, or Byron, who saw in them a shameful episode of plundering. Poets and also painters framed how we see these marbles, as sublime museum objects or as trafficked loots. Moving through Ottoman Athens and Regency London with a cast of colorful characters, Stallings explores how their words and images connect Grecian grandeur with the last poor plunder of a bleeding land. Please welcome Professor Stallings.
Thank you so much, Verena, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to the Council and Getty for having me, to Jens for the initial invitation, which was very exciting, to Lisa and Ivy and Arne and all those who have helped arrange this event today. Lectures about the marbles of the Parthenon and their fate tend to start with a bang. In particular, the explosion on the 25th of September, 1687, by a Venetian cannonball that left the Parthenon, at that point a splendid mosque, which had stood for 2 millennia since the Athens of Pericles, largely intact, a picturesque ruin. Instead, let me begin by skipping to Regency England, to March of 1817 in London, where the smashed marbles were instead smashing records as crowds came to visit them where they had been newly installed in the British Museum. We tend to forget how exciting and even unsettling the arrival of Elgin's collection of marbles were. This was not Dickensian London, gloomy and Victorian, all buttoned up respectability or ragged poverty, but if you will, Bridgerton London, where aristocrats, boxers, painters, and poets all might mingle at a tavern in St. Giles, the Horse and Dolphin, near the Royal Academy of Art, run by retired prizefighter Bill the Black Terror Richmond, who had been born into slavery in colonial America. Britain was still reeling from the loss of its colony, and the war with Napoleon revived a patriotic pride and fervor. Purchased by the government after a contentious debate the year before, and installed in the temporary Elgin Room, an ad hoc addition to the British Museum, the marbles welcomed huge, curious crowds in early 1817. This is the moment, only weeks after the marbles have gone on public display, when a 22-year-old aspiring poet, recently a student of anatomy at Guy's Hospital and surgeon in training, John Keats, encountered them alongside his friend, the irascible painter, memoirist, and polemicist, I like that as a kind of adjective, Robert Benjamin Hayden, then in his early 30s and already producing his gigantic, albeit hugely unpopular, historical paintings. It is an important moment in the history of poetry and in the history of the marbles. Exciting or even overwhelmed by Hayden's own contagious enthusiasm, Keats pens 2 sonnets that very night and publishes them within days in Leigh Hunt's Examiner. They were published one on top of the other, and it wasn't signed John Keats, it was just signed J.K. The first one is addressed directly to Hayden. Hayden, forgive me, that I cannot speak definitively on these mighty things. Forgive me that I have not eagle's wings, that what I want I know not where to seek, and think that I would not be over meek in rolling out up-followed thunderings, even to the steep of Heliconian springs, were I of ample strength for such a freak. Think too that all those numbers should be thine, whose else in this who touched thy vesture's hem? For when men stared at what was most divine with browless idiotism, o'erwise phlegm, thou hadst beheld the Hesperian shine of their star in the east and gone to worship them. For obvious reasons, browless idiotism and o'erwise phlegm are not phrases for the anthologies. But the next sonnet, perhaps tossed off immediately after, proves to be a keeper. On seeing the Elgin marbles. My spirit is too weak. Mortality weighs heavily on me like unwilling sleep, and each imagined pinnacle and steep of godlike hardship tells me I must die like a sick eagle looking at the sky. Yet 'tis a gentle luxury to weep that I have not the cloudy winds to keep fresh for the opening of the morning's eye. Such dim conceived glories of the brain bring round the heart an undescribable feud. So do these wonders a most dizzy pain that mingles Grecian grandeur with the rude wasting of old time, with a billowy mane, a sun, a shadow of a magnitude. Well, there are many fine phrases here. Shadow of a magnitude, as well as Keatsian themes of mortality and art. But this is still more, there's more of Stendhal syndrome than precisely observed ekphrasis in this sonnet. You remember that Stendhal syndrome is this psychosomatic effect that art could have on people that might reduce somebody into their heart beating wildly, or they might even faint. So we have this kind of romantic, overwhelming feeling of sublimity on looking at the marbles. This is what the temporary Elgin room looked like. This is perhaps how they were first displayed. This was painted not too long after Keats's and Haydn's trip to the British Museum. So this was built out of wood, maybe kind of out of plywood. It was done pretty quickly. The architect, Smirke, who will go on to be the architect of the facade of the British Museum as we know it. You'll see the frieze is kind of at eye level. The metopes are up higher. And then some things are kind of higgledy-piggledy. We see the horse head of Cellini on the floor. I don't know that that was actually how, this may have been partly just for the purpose of the painting. You will see the Theseus and the river god Ilissos. The two reclining pedimental figures are on kind of bench-like plinths. If you look at one of them, you can see that the plinths can actually be turned and moved, and this was so that artists could paint this or draw the statues from all sides. This is a less idealized version of the room. What we just saw is at the far end, but this is maybe a longer view of things. But again, there's kind of stuff against the walls. It's maybe not how we imagine the Elgin marbles or the marbles of the Parthenon today. Without that sonnet's title on seeing the Elgin marbles, it wouldn't really be clear what Keats was looking at. The presence in both sonnets of eagles might be due in part to the Greek word aitoma, pediment, which was translated as eagles in the parliamentary debate. The billowy mane might have been evoked when Haydn, recounting some of the marble's misadventures, described a shipment on Lord Elgin's brig, the Mentor, which sank in 1802 in rough seas off the island of Kythera. 17 crates of sculptures ended up at the bottom of the billowy mane, rescued over the next 2 years with the help of Greek sponge divers brought in from Symi and Kalymnos, and at a cost to Elgin of £5,000. Haydn would have waxed lyrical about the perfection glimpsed through the fragmentary. In the most broken fragment, he says, the same great principle of life can be proved to exist as in the most perfect figure, he had observed. And this, again, was an unusual view of sculpture and kind of a revolutionary one. It is irresistible to try to imagine Haydn pontificating with Keats in tow, perhaps dumbfounded. Haydn had been obsessed with the marbles and would continue to be so for the rest of his life, since he first encountered them nearly a decade earlier in 1808 in a damp, dirty penthouse in a yard on Park Lane where the marbles had lain within sight and reach. Haydn probably is most well known today for his autobiography. If you're looking for an excellent read, I highly recommend it. He describes gossipy things about all of his friends, and he has wonderful observations. So he describes this experience of first having encountered the marbles in this random shed in an aristocrat's yard. The first thing I fixed my eyes on was the wrist of a figure in one of the female groups. in which were visible, though in a feminine form, the radius and ulna. I was astonished, for I had never seen them hinted at any female wrist in the antique. I darted my eye to the elbow and saw the outer condyle visibly affecting the shape, as in nature. The combination of nature and idea, which I had felt was so much wanting for high art, was here displayed to midday conviction. My heart beat. I felt the future. I foretold that they would prove themselves the finest things on earth, that they would overturn the false beau ideal where nature was nothing and would establish the true beau ideal of which nature alone is the basis. I felt as if a divine truth had blazed inwardly upon my mind. Haydn concludes this recollection with, I do not say this now, when all the world acknowledges it, but I said it then when no one would believe me. In fact, on his second visit to these marbles in Park Lane, he dragged with him the Swiss painter Henry Fuseli, and Fuseli endeared himself to Haydn forever with his uncompromising enthusiasm, striding around and exclaiming, "De Greeks were gods! De Greeks were gods!" While less successful as a painter, Haydn was clearly a very fine draftsman, as we can see from this famous drawing of the horse head of Cellini. This not from the British Museum's temporary Elgin room, but the damp shed on Park Lane. So this comes from the Eastern Pediment, which depicts the birth of Athena and the horses of Cellini, of the moon, of the night, have been racing across the sky all day, so they are exhausted. The horse's nostrils are flared, its eyes are bugging out of its skull because it is, imagine lathered with sweat. Besides the precision of observation here, I'm intrigued, if you look at the ear, that Haydn at this point kind of considers what it might be like to restore the statues. What if that ear were finished? This is another view of the horse head. And here is that horse head now. This is the head after the Duveen cleaning with wire brushes in 1937, 1938. You can see that there's much less definition. An inquiry on this disastrous intervention noted that the horse head appeared to have been skinned. And this is what the arrangement in Park Lane looked like. So again, things are kind of higgledy-piggledy. There are more things than just Parthenon marbles here. The horse head of Cellini is up on a random column. We see the famous caryatid, and there are various architectural elements just lying around. After his first visit to the marbles, Keats would often return to the British Museum. His friend, the artist Joseph Severn, reminisced that Keats went again and again to see the Elgin marbles and would sit for an hour or more at a time beside them, wrapped in reverie. Perhaps as Keats began to actually see the marbles, the suggestive narratives unfolded that would find themselves instead on a Greek pot in Ode on a Grecian Urn. Who are these coming to the sacrifice, goes one of the stanzas. To what green altar, O mysterious priest, leadst thou that heifer lowing at the skies, and all her silken flanks with garlands dressed? What little town by river or seashore or mountain built with peaceful citadel is emptied of this folk, this pious morn? That poem's cold pastoral of unheard melodies concludes, oddly enough, with an utterance in the voice of the Grecian urn itself. Famously, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. But that voice, Keats imagining what the Grecian urn might say, sounds to me an awful lot like Haydn's. Truth and beauty were among the issues debated, in fact, in the Select Committee of the House of Commons on potentially purchasing the collection from Elgin for the UK government. For many artists, this discovery with the marbles was that truth to nature, anatomical precision, was not somehow opposed to beauty, the beau ideal, as Haydn put it, but intrinsic to it. Keats would have been acutely aware of the debate almost a year before to the day of the famous visit with Haydn, because Haydn had been actively involved in it, if on the sidelines. He was furious not to have been one of the artists invited to give testimony to the committee, and so instead he had to take to writing fulminating letters on the marble's artistic worth in the Examiner. It is important to note here, I'm not going to do a lot of the history of the taking of the marbles, so I'll do just a little bit. It is important to note here that Thomas Bruce, the 7th Lord Elgin, had been made ambassador to the Ottoman Empire shortly, almost right after, in fact, the Battle of the Nile in 1798, when Horatio Nelson's defeat of Napoleon greatly endeared the British, at least briefly, to Sultan Selim III. To get a sense of how grateful, here is a painting of Nelson done shortly after. That big, fancy feather in his cap, the huge jewel, is a Chelenk, a military award of the Ottoman Empire. Nelson was the first non-Ottoman so honored. The 13 sprays of the aigrette represent the 13 French ships sunk or captured in battle. The central diamonds were reckoned to be worth 1,000 pounds apiece, and there were 300 other diamonds in the jewel. This jewel no longer exists. It was stolen by the infamous cat burglar George Taters Chatham in 1951 and was probably sold for parts. So this was a brief, rosy period of British-Ottoman relations. Just a couple years after this, they will be at war with each other. And it's in this rosy period that Elgin arrives in Athens. So how he had acquired the marbles, whether he had done so in some official capacity as ambassador, was one of the issues. The other issue for the purchase of the marbles that was discussed, at least in the newspapers, this debate came in the wake of the Battle of Waterloo, in the wake of the year without a summer, a climate event triggered by the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia that resulted in lower temperatures globally and incessant rain and crop failures in Europe. So even though the purchase at £45,000 was for less than half of Elgin's asking price, and that asking price of £74,000 was supposed to only cover his expenses in getting them to London, it was considered by many a wasteful and frivolous use of government funds. So it was controversial from the get-go. This is a very famous cartoon by Cruikshank that gives voice and face to many of the objections. The man in the top hat is Lord Castlereagh, and he says to John Bull, the colored figure in a colored coat, John Bull is a sort of ale-drinking, patriotic, dog-loving British everyman. He's your everyday British guy. And Lord Castlereagh says to him, "Here's a bargain for you, Johnny. Only £35,000. I have bought them on purpose for you. Never think of bread when you can have stones so wondrous cheap." John Bull's plentiful children, many children, beg him to buy bread instead. "Daddy, Daddy, buy us bread. We don't want stones." While his practical wife exclaims, "Let him take his stones back again to the Turks. We don't want them in this country," making them sound a little bit like immigrants. John Bull himself gives many of the reasons for the debate in the first place. I don't think somehow that these here stones are perfect. I had rather not buy them at present. Trade is very bad and provision very dear, and my family can't eat stones. Besides, they say it will cost £40,000 to build a place to put them in. And here's, I think, the critical bit. As the Turks gave them to our ambassador in his official capacity for little or nothing, and solely out of compliment to the British nation, I think he should not charge such an enormous price for packing and carriage. And in the upper corner, we have a reference to Elgin's memorandum, just published speculation or travels in the East in search of ruinous fragments of stone for John Bull by Lord Elgin. Note, not ruined stone, but ruinous ones, as they would certainly be for Elgin himself, who eventually died utterly bankrupt. We can see, too, in this image that the marbles have not achieved their iconic status. Almost nothing is recognizable. The female figure looks like nothing so much as a broken mannequin. There is a mysterious Hermes. There's an assortment of broken stones. As Byron put it in his Hints from Horace, let Aberdeen and Elgin still pursue the shade of fame through regions of virtue, waste useless thousands on their Phidian freaks, misshapen monuments, and maimed antiques. To appreciate the shock of the unrestored, fragmented marbles left in their raw state, mostly because Elgin could not afford to restore them and because Canova thankfully declined to lay a finger on them, we need to realize what the British public was used to thinking in terms of classical art. So the British Museum had shortly before this acquired the Townley collection. This was what British art looked like to Regency London. These are Roman copies of Greek originals. They have all been restored to a kind of perfect completeness by either Renaissance sculptors or their disciples. So if you compare the Elgin marbles are violent in their fragmentation. The diarist and landscape artist Joseph Farrington records in 1808, for instance, Sir George Beaumont's recommendation that the mutilated fragments brought from Athens by Lord Elgin should be restored, as at present they excite rather disgust than pleasure in the minds of people in general to see parts of limbs, bodies, stumps of arms, etc. Hayden felt that the marbles were going to found a new school of art in Britain, a northern Renaissance. His large-scale historical paintings don't seem to bear that out, though. Work on this painting dates from around the same time as that visit to the British Museum, and viewing its progress made for the occasion of Hayden's famous Immortal Dinner in December of that year, 1817, which included Wordsworth, John Keats, Charles Lamb, and others. Keats, Wordsworth, William Hazlitt, as well as Newton and Voltaire all have cameos in this painting. It is actually hard to, this painting is huge. It's something like 13 feet by 15 feet. The Christ is 9 feet tall. And, you know, that sort of dark, misshapen donkey in the middle kind of sucking up all the light out of the picture. You can go see this. It's in Cincinnati, Ohio. I would like to see it someday. But when Hayden had finally finished this painting and exhibited it in 1820, typical of Hayden's luck, the painting was upstaged at the same show by another large-scale painting, which you might have heard of, Jericho's The Raft of the Medusa. Hayden, unlike poor Keats, who died at the age of 25, lived until 60, long enough to see his judgment of the marbles fully vindicated. He was not a success as a painter, however. A 2009 biography of the man is titled A Genius for Failure. At the age of 60, in a state of despair and debt, Hayden attempted to take his own life, first botching a gunshot to the head, which missed the brain, ironic for a student of anatomy. He finally succeeded by slitting his own throat and spattering the unfinished canvas of one of his unpopular historical paintings with his own blood. In an obituary, Charles Dickens said of him, he most unquestionably was a very bad painter, and of his Nero painting that it was quite marvelous in its badness. Poor Hayden. That this collection of marbles were moved from Athens and ended up in London in the first place owed in no small part to another painter, one not of gigantic historical oil paintings, but exquisite watercolor landscapes, closely observed from nature and eschewing historical narrative. When Elgin was headed out to Constantinople to take up his position as ambassador, one of his aims was to collect marbles to decorate his renovated house, Broom Hall in Scotland, for his new bride, the fabulously wealthy heiress and Scottish beauty Mary Nisbet, and he went to Athens with a posse of artists to paint and model antiquities. Giovanni Battista Lucieri was his second choice. An Italian landscape painter from Naples, he had been court painter to Ferdinand I of the Two Sicilies before William Hamilton, who is Elgin's private secretary, and also the man who brought the Rosetta Stone to the British Museum. He's hired by William Hamilton, and Lucieri becomes involved in the removal and shipping of the marbles of the Parthenon. But Elgin's first choice was none other than J.M.W. Turner. But Turner turned him down since the salary was too low. Lucieri received £200 per annum. I'm giving you some of these numbers so you start to get an idea of how much £35,000 is. Mr. Turner's objection, Elgin says, to my plan was that as the object was of a general nature and that the condition I insisted upon was that the whole results of all the artists should be collected together and left with me, he objected because he wished to retain a certain portion of his own labor for his own use. He, moreover, asked between £700 and £800 of salary, independently of his expenses being paid, which of course was out of my reach altogether. One suspects that had Turner accepted, the history of the marbles might be altogether different. Lucieri believed that one should faithfully imitate nature. Byron reckoned him an Italian painter of the first eminence. Lucieri lamented later in his life that had he not gotten involved with the marbles and Athens, he would have had a greater career as a painter. But as it was, he served as a kind of tour guide to any of the foreigners coming to Athens, including Byron. Here we have one of his exquisite watercolors of a Grecian urn, a double urn, which he excavated in Attica. Lucieri, besides being the person most responsible for taking things off the Parthenon, also was sort of employed almost full-time as a grave robber throughout Attica. So he excavated this double urn. It's a marble urn with a bronze dinos inside. It also had, which you can kind of see at the top, a gold sprig of myrtle. And here is Lucieri's painting of the southeastern corner of the Acropolis. Ironically, it would be Lucieri himself who would severely damage this corner of the building to extract the metapiece for Elgin. So this is like the last image we have of this corner of the Parthenon before it looks like this. So you can see that in order to extract the metapiece, which are the ornamental blocks between the triglyphs in that upper register there, you have to take the marble from on top of it to pull them out like teeth. And in fact, he knocks off and shatters that whole cornice. There were many eyewitnesses to this destruction, including a young Robert Smirke, later architect of the temporary Elgin Room and the facade of the British Museum. And he wrote, "It particularly affected me when I saw the destruction made to get down the basso reliefs on the walls, men laboring with iron crows to move the stones of these firm-built walls. Each stone, as it fell, shook the ground with its ponderous weight, with a deep, hollow noise. It seemed like a convulsive groan of the injured spirit of the temple." Lucieri's double urn, by the way, which he discovered in a grave which contained the gold myrtle sprig, ashes and bones, he reburied the ashes and bones, and he thought this was the grave of Aspasia, was one of the centerpieces of Elgin's collection as it was displayed in the temporary Elgin Room, where John Keats spent so many hours in meditation. So you will see that that double urn is at the very center of the display in Athens. And again, this is how the marbles were displayed when they were first arrived in Athens in the tent or the shed, as it were, in Park Lane. And this drawing was sent to Lucieri in Athens so he could see how they were being displayed in London. Keats would have been aware, of course, of the controversy over Elgin's removals, not only from the newspaper coverage over the government debate over whether to purchase them and Haydn's incessant rants, but from a best-selling poem which had appeared 5 years earlier when Keats was but a teenager. In 1812, the poet and aristocrat Lord Byron published the first 2 cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, verse autofiction about his travels in Greece and Albania, and he became a celebrity overnight. I woke one morning and found myself famous. In the poem, Byron savages Elgin's removals from the Parthenon as looting and plunder. Elgin also awoke one morning and found himself notorious. Byron, in class solidarity, aristocrat to aristocrat, had warned Elgin that he was going to publish something unpleasant about him. I wrote to him, Elgin, at his request, all I know about his robberies, and at last have written to say that as it is my intention to publish on that topic, I thought proper, since he insisted on seeing me, to give him notice that he might not have an opportunity of accusing me of double dealing afterwards. Meanwhile, Elgin's secretary, William Hamilton, the Rosetta Stone guy, assured Elgin that any publicity was good publicity. I do not consider Byron a very formidable enemy in his mediated attack, and I shall be much surprised if his attack on what you have done do not turn out one of the most friendly acts he could have done. It will create an interest in the public, excite curiosity, and the real advantage to this country and the merit of your exertions will become more known and felt as they are more known. He could not have been more wrong. Published on March 3rd, 1812, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, first run of 500 quarto copies sold out in 3 days. Maybe that doesn't sound like a lot. I am a poet. I'm just telling you that now 500 copies in 3 days would be staggering. There were 10 editions of the work within 3 years. And it contained such stanzas as the following. But who of all the plunderers of yon fane will remember that a fane is a temple on high where Pallas lingered, Pallas being Athena, loath to flee, the latest relic of her ancient reign, the last, worse, dull spoiler. Who was he? Blush, Caledonia, i.e. Scotland, such thy son could be. England, I joy, no child he was of thine. Thy free-born men should spare what once was free, yet they could violate each saddening shrine and bear these altars o'er the long reluctant brine. But most the modern Picts ignoble boast to rive what Goth and Turk and time hath spared. Cold as the crags upon his native coast, his mind as barren and his heart as hard, is he whose head conceived, whose hand prepared, ought to displace Athena's poor remains, her sons too weak the sacred shrine to guard, yet felt some portion of their mother's pains, and never knew till then the weight of despots' chains. It goes on. The ocean queen, the free Britannia, bears the last poor plunder from a bleeding land. Cursed be the hour when from their isle they roved, and once again thy hapless bosom gored, and snatched thy shrinking gods to northern climes abhorred. The despoliation of the temple, as Byron would have it, had happened when Byron was but a schoolboy in Harrow. He never saw the temple before Elgin's operations, and Keats would never make it as far as Greece and see the Parthenon at all. Byron would never see the marbles in the British Museum. But Byron's objection to Elgin's actions had not so much to do with the worth of the marbles themselves, but to the diminishment of the ancient site. So he would have come when you could really see there were raw marks in the marble, and it was just clear that something terrible had happened to the site. He was, for the picturesque ruins, ruined. He wrote to his publisher, John Murray, from Ravenna in 1821, "There are 1,000 rocks and capes far more picturesque than those of the Acropolis and Cape Sunium in themselves. What are they to 1,000 scenes in the wilder parts of Greece, of Asia Minor, Switzerland? I opposed and will ever oppose the robbery of ruins from Athens to instruct the English in sculpture, who are as capable of sculpture as the Egyptians are of skating. But why do I do so? The ruins are as poetical in Piccadilly as they were in the Parthenon, but the Parthenon and its rock are less so without them. Such is the poetry of art. Although Byron never saw the Parthenon in its pre-Elgin state, nor saw the marbles in their museumified dignity in the British Museum, he had seen Elgin's marbles up close in London shortly before he left England for his first visit to Greece in 1809. Like Haydn, he saw them in the shed at the corner of Park Lane and Piccadilly, where Elgin had stationed them in the yard of Gloucester House. And we have a description of this from another poem, The Curse of Minerva. This is a poem that was so libelous, Byron didn't publish it. It went into salacious detail about Elgin's divorce, including mention of a bastard child. This is the only image we have of Elgin. This is from 1788. That's because not too long after this, Elgin's nose fell off. And the rumor, which may not have been true, maybe it was some kind of staph infection, but the rumor was that it was syphilis, and there were a lot of jokes about that. In The Curse of Minerva, Byron writes, "Some retribution still might Pallas claim when Venus half avenged Minerva's shame." So that was a reference to the nose. So he couldn't, his friends told him, you can't publish this poem, you're going to be sued for libel. But he did release 8 copies that got widely pirated. So written in Athens and dated March 17th, 1811, Byron's poem yet recalls events from London in 1808, when Elgin, deeply in debt and trying to drum up interest in his raw, fragmented marbles, hit upon combining his controversial fragments with the wildly popular English pastime of boxing. Bare-knuckle boxing was technically illegal, but if you've watched Bridgerton, you will know wildly popular with aristocrats. The aristocrat fan base was known as the fancy, painters, sculptors, writers, and also the lower orders. And, you know, in fact, boxers would go to the Royal Academy to pose for the anatomy classes, and then the Royal Academy painters would go hang out at the tavern. The Cockney Keats enjoyed attending bouts in London, and the aristocrat Byron was not only a fan, but took up the sport at the gym of and under the guidance of Gentleman John Jackson. You can see that there's already an association of boxers with sculpture. This is the Borghese Gladiator, and there's a copy in the gym. So Joseph Farrington, again, the mediocre landscape painter and important Royal Academist, and diarist, writes that 19th June 1808, they visited the home of Dr. Anthony Carlyle, soon to be elected president of the Royal Academy, soon to be elected professor of anatomy at the Royal Academy, where the company were presented with Bob Gregson, the pugilist, stripped naked to be exhibited to us on account of the fineness of his form. 10 days later, they hit upon the idea of exhibiting a naked Gregson in the shed with the marbles, so that Gregson could pose naked next to the Theseus and the Ilissos, and people could compare the physiques of one with the other. Really, I think Bridgerton missed a trick. They could have done this. So he posed for 2 hours. And the implication was that a fit British body and fighting form was the natural modern expression of idealized Greek masculine beauty. And at the end of July of that year, 4 of the leading fighters of the day, Jem Jackson, Byron's trainer, Belcher, Gully, and Dutch Sam, were brought to Elgin's for a pugilistic exhibition. Farrington noted that the sculptor John Rossi particularly admired Dutch Sam's figure on account of the symmetry and the parts being expressed. And you can see here in this sculpture, this is called Athleta Britannicus. It's the British athlete. He's bare-chested, which was a recent improvement or whatever in boxing. He's wearing kind of British breeches, but also Greco-Roman sandals. It's very strange sculpture. But Byron seems to have been there when the naked boxers were presented next to the sculptors, and he has this description of that moment in The Curse of Minerva. "Be all the bruisers culled from all St. Giles, that art and nature may compare their styles, while brawny brutes in stupid wonder stare and marvel at his lordship's stone shop there. Round the thronged gate shall sauntering coxcombs creep to lounge and lucubrate, to prate and peep, while many a languid maid with longing eye on giant statues casts the curious eye. The Rome with transient glance appears to skim, yet marks the mighty back and length of limb, mourns o'er the difference of now and then, exclaims, "These Greeks indeed were proper men," draws slight comparisons of these with those, and envies Laius all her Attic beaux. When shall a modern maid have swains like these? Alas, Sir Harry is no Hercules. And last of all, amidst the gaping crew, some calm spectator, as he takes his view in silent indignation mixed with grief, admires the plunder, but abhors the thief. Do we have any doubt that the calm spectator in silent indignation is none other than Byron? There was another factor in the House of Commons debate, a reason that the acquisition of the marbles was so controversial. Again and again, the artists and antiquarians and collectors at that discussion and investigation are asked to compare Elgin's fragmented marbles to figures such as the Belvedere Apollo. The Belvedere Apollo was at the time considered to be the most beautiful statue in the world. So this was, on the face of it, a debate about truth and beauty. The committee asked various members of the Royal Academy, do you think the Theseus as fine a sculpture as the Apollo? Do you think it more or less of ideal beauty than the Apollo? And there were different answers. Not everyone said one or the other. So truth and beauty, beauty and truth. But the Belvedere Apollo had been much in the news. Looted by Napoleon, this statue and things like the horses of St. Mark had spent nearly a decade in the Louvre. But after Waterloo in 1815 exasperated, Britain and her allies did something unheard of in the history of warfare. They insisted that the defeated nation return the artwork it had looted. So the debate over the Elgin marbles took place with a completely new concept on the table, that cultural objects belong to the cultures from which they were taken. So this is quite radical, but we do have to understand the debates in that light. So the potential British hypocrisy of demanding the French return the irregularly acquired treasures from their imperial museum, the Louvre, while making the opposite case to keep Greece wasn't a nation yet, but Ottoman Greece in their own, the British Museum, was clear to some writers even at the time. For instance, the artist, critic, and philosopher William Hazlitt, who wrote extensively about Elgin marbles and about boxing, sometimes in the same essay. He writes, for instance, in his essay Prose Style and the Elgin Marbles, it were to be wished that the French sculptors would come over and look at the Elgin marbles as they are arranged with great care and some pomp at the British Museum. They may smile to see that we are willing to remove art from their original places of abode, though we will not allow others to do so. Felicia Hemans, the leading female English poet of her day, and in sales, second only to Byron, so that's kind of a big deal. And Byron kind of ungraciously referred to her as Mrs. He-Womans. She's remembered now mostly for her schoolroom recitation chestnut Casabianca, which begins, "The boy stood on the burning deck," set during the pivotal 1798 Battle of the Nile, and for her phrase, "The stately homes of England." A precocious young poet, her first book would be published to much acclaim when she was only 14. Shelley approached her by letter, but given his penchant for marrying teenage girls, it is probably for the best that her mother discouraged this correspondence. Hemans wrote prolifically through her life, supporting her family of 5 children with her pen after her husband abandoned her. Her poem on the restoration of art to Italy, written by, quote unquote, a lady, was financially a flop, but it is an important measure of sentiment at the time over the return of objects to their native lands. Fair Florence, queen of Arno's lovely vale, justice and truth indignant heard thy tale, and sternly smiled in retribution's hour to wrest thy treasures from the spoiler's power. Too long the spirits of thy noble dead mourned o'er the domes they reared in ages fled, those classic scenes their pride so richly graced, temples of genius, palaces of taste. So on the one hand, she writes that it's fantastic that all of these treasures are returned to Italy. But in 1816, hearing about the popularity of the marbles in London, she got an idea for what she hoped would be a bestseller along the lines of Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, and wrote to Byron's publisher, John Murray. I'm told that a poem on the Elgin marbles would be likely to be popular at present, and some of my friends have recommended me to attempt one. She sent her long poem, Modern Greece, or the Elgin Marbles, to Murray in early 1817. This poem, published anonymously, did much better. People assumed it was written by a man, and many thought it was written by Byron himself. And it has things about how Athens is not able to protect its antiquities. The Olympian groups have sunk and are forgot. Not e'en their dust could weeping Athens guard, but these were destined to a nobler lot, and they have borne to light another land. So it's a good thing that the marbles are in London. Byron, who had approved of some of her earlier poetry, was not impressed. In September of 1817, he writes to John Murray, they shared a publisher, Modern Greece, good for nothing, written by someone who has never been there. Besides, why modern? You may say modern Greeks, but surely Greece itself is rather more ancient than ever it was. Athens is not a fit place for the marbles, according to Hemans, but these marbles are going to light the way for a new school of art. Again, this is sort of paraphrasing Haydn, light the way for a new English Michelangelo. If Keats abstracted the marbles into museum objects or pure art and truth, and Byron insisted upon their removal as a crime to their original context, and Elgin as a despoiler of Athena's sacred temple, Felicia Hemans finds a sort of middle ground. In fact, she aligns herself entirely with Haydn, that the marbles have been rescued from endangering neglect, that they are creating a new basis for art. Yet modern Greece is, for all that, in favor, as indeed Elgin was, though I don't think he will ever be acknowledged as a Philhellene in Greece, of Greek independence, and passionately supported the stirring of a war of independence from the Ottoman Empire. Neither Keats nor Byron writes about the marbles in any kind of detailed, descriptive way. We know nothing from those poems about how the marbles looked, only how the poets feel in their presence. Hemans had never been to the British Museum. She almost certainly pored over engravings of the marbles and read widely and deeply on the topic, including pieces by Benjamin Haydon, as the 40-plus scholarly notes to the poem note. She is arguably, perhaps, however, the first poet to describe the frieze, the procession of horses and horsemen, maidens and matrons leading animals to sacrifice. Mark on the storied frieze, the graceful train, the holy festival's triumphal throng in fair procession to Minerva's fane, with many a sacred symbol move along. There every shade of bright existence trace, the fire of youth, the dignity of age, the matron's calm austerity of grace, the ardent warrior, the benignant sage, the nymph's light symmetry, the chief's proud mien, each ray of beauty caught and mingled in the scene. Byron would die in 1824 in Missolonghi, giving his life and fortune to the cause of Greek independence. He alone, it would seem, among his peers and acquaintances was not, as he put it, a collector. He cared more for the fate of Greece itself. Keats would die just a few years earlier, in 1821, in Rome, perhaps unaware that he would be deemed one of the greatest of the English poets. He would never make it as far as Greece and never see the Parthenon. Elgin's collection would be, in a sense, the closest he would come. But the collection would continue to haunt him, even, it seems, on his deathbed in Rome. Elgin's collection, I should point out, consisted of a lot of other things, not just the marbles of the Parthenon. There is the lone caryatid, for instance, from the Erechtheion. There is the monumental scarab beetle made of diorite he had picked up in Constantinople. It's usually on display in the Egyptian galleries in the British Museum. It was known at the time as Elgin's beetle. There were also some fragile wooden musical instruments that Lucieri had excavated from graves in Attica in his long career as a tomb robber. Among them are these sycamore pipes. There is also the lyre of Elgin. This is not the original tortoiseshell, which has long since disintegrated after its excavation, but a new one. Elgin's lyre of wood and tortoiseshell and two pipes were both objects Keats spent a lot of time contemplating, and I think also factor into the ode on a Grecian urn. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes, play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared, pipe to the spirit ditties of no tone. Keats' friend, Joseph Severn, sketched both the lyre, Elgin's lyre, and Elgin's oboes on the first page of Charles Brown's copy of Keats's Endymion. Elgin's lyre also features on Keats's headstone in Rome. The image of the lyre with the broken strings, he claimed, was Keats's own idea. I have proposed, he writes to a friend about Keats's tombstone, to introduce a Greek lyre, very simple, with 4 of the strings broken. This was Keats' idea a long time back in England. Brown will find a drawing of mine in his copy of Endymion, drawn at Keats's request. So the Elgin collection echoed in the mind of Keats down the years. Lucieri's excavation ends up being alluded to in the Protestant graveyard at Rome, and even the most fragile object in Elgin's collection of wood and tortoiseshell ended up carved in marble for posterity, something Phidias, perhaps, would have understood. Thank you.
Well, thank you for a fascinating lecture that gave a new and inspiring angle to a topic that we're all so excited about. I'm sure there will be lots of questions and maybe comments, and the speaker kindly agreed to answer them. Or she will try, yes. So, who will break the ice? Okay, then I'll do.
Okay.
So, you've mentioned the beginnings and everything, and, you know, when reading your book, maybe you'd like to share how you got excited. Of course, living in Athens and, you know, raising your son in Athens and all of this. But how did you get inspired into the topic, and how was your journey towards it?
I usually write books of poems or translation. This is my first foray into nonfiction. This is a lot of work. But it started off in COVID as a blog post. I was supposed to do a blog post, I think, for the American Scholar, and I was just going to do a quick and dirty blog post about 3 poets and their views of the marbles. So it was going to be Keats, Byron, and Cavafy. And I just kept going down one rabbit hole after another until there was this whole warren of rabbit holes. I became obsessed because I kept finding out new things that I didn't know and just going, what? And, finding out like so-and-so that is in one aspect of the marbles ends up knowing so-and-so. And, everything was weirdly intertwined. And, at the end of the day, I would tell my husband, and this, and this. And so I just kept adding on until it was one of those things. It was too long for an article and too short for a book. So then I just made it long enough for a book. And it helps because there are appendices, like there's a whole appendix about how to think about the money, which was one of the things I had a lot of trouble with, because you can't just say a pound in 1816 is worth X. It depends on what kind of thing it is. I mean, it is helpful to think about maybe Darcy as being fantastically wealthy at $10,000 a year. But, so I just ended up learning all kinds of things that I was excited about. I live in Athens. I see the Parthenon every day, so that's kind of where it came from.
Hi, Alicia. I was wondering if you were thinking of writing your own poem about the Parthenon marbles.
Well, look, I was actually commissioned by the British Museum to write a poem about an object in the British Museum. And I was excited about that because they asked several poets to do this. I was one of the poets. But the real reason I said yes was they said like that a curator would show you any object in the museum. And so I wanted to pick something that was not on display, was associated with Elgin, had not been displayed for maybe 200 years, but was also too big to be brought out to a reading room. So the object I picked was, you can probably guess, that. The bronze Dinos is on display and the gold myrtle sprig, but the big marble thing is not, the big marble urn. So I got to go down into the sepulchral basement, definitely haunted, and visit my urn, and I wrote a sort of another ode to a different urn.
Thank you very, very much for that enlightening talk. You called out Lucieri as being largely responsible and also named him as a tomb robber. And Elgin gets most of the opprobrium for what Lucieri did. And I wonder if in your research, you're able to sort of disambiguate the two. How much did Elgin know and support what Lucieri was doing? How much did he just accept it after the fact? Could you talk a little more about the relationship between the two of them?
I mean, it is an interesting relationship. Definitely Elgin is the impetus behind everything. Elgin only spent about 50 days in Athens. Lucieri spent years in Athens. But Elgin basically said, take everything you can. He would give them laundry lists. He wanted the whole Erechtheion, the whole Porch of the Maidens, but actually the locals in Athens were very, very attached to the Caryatids, so that wasn't going to happen. But Lucieri also seemed to be very keen to please Elgin. Often, at a certain point, wasn't getting paid. But continue, and at a certain point, all excavations on the Acropolis itself were shut down. But Lucieri just continued to pay local workmen to dig up all of Attica, basically. I mean, everyone, I guess, maybe was doing it. I don't know. I mean, strangely, in Athens, Lucieri is remembered very fondly. If you will talk to like the culture minister or whatever, it's like the only reason it wasn't worse is because of Lucieri, which is maybe wrong. His gravestone of Pendelic marble is propped in a corner of the Church of St. Paul's in Athens. And obviously he was quite sensitive to the site. He's a beautiful painter. Most of his paintings were lost in a shipwreck, so we only have a fraction of the work that he did in Athens. But certainly he seems to want to please Elgin, and he's constantly writing to him, like, look what I've got for you. I've got this as well for you. He seems to be a people pleaser. Byron liked Lucieri. Everyone liked Lucieri. But originally, really, Elgin wanted everything, and it was, whatever he later said he wanted to do, originally it was to decorate his house.
Okay, some online questions?
Do you have any thoughts about the dichotomy between, one, Byron's lionizing of the Parthenon marbles and their ancient Greek creators, and two, his criticizing Elgin while calling him a modern Pict?
Well, look, actually, Byron doesn't really lionize the marbles of the Parthenon at all. He calls them, Phidian freaks. He's not really interested in them. I mean, he's sad to see them in their corrupted state, as it were, in London in a kind of louche situation of naked, people and so on. But in Don Juan, he writes about comparing a woman to a marble statue, and then he says, but you know what? I'd much rather look at a real woman. I'm not interested in comparing her to a marble statue. She's a real live Greek woman is more interesting to me than a statue of a Greek woman. So I don't think he does lionize the marbles of the Parthenon. Again, he's interested in them being on the building. He's interested in the fact that he got to see the Parthenon in a less good state than people 10 years before. He really feels that it's the site itself that is damaged. I'm not sure I answered the question, but that's kind of the difference to me.
He was insulting.
Oh yeah, he insults Elgin, which was common, the idea that, there are vandals and so forth that attack the Parthenon, but, the worst is this Pict from Scotland.
There's another question about color and how much it was known at the time that there were colors on the Parthenon marbles.
It was known at the time, but it was shocking to people. Again, they were used to this kind of Townley collection. They were used to seeing this. But it was known, and it was debated, it was discussed in the debate, the parliamentary debate. There were some bits of color even on the Parthenon marbles as they arrived in Athens, maybe a little bit. But where they knew, Cockerell, who takes the marbles from Aegina. So there's a temple, the Temple of Aphae at Aegina. Emboldened by Elgin, he bribes officials, and they excavate, and they find all of these statues. And it is mentioned in the committee debate that those were wildly, even garishly colored, and sometimes gilded. So people knew it, but they didn't want to know it because there were racial implications with the whiteness of the marbles. And even in 1868, when we have this painting displayed, it's criticized for its fairground colors, even though it was firmly established that the frieze would have been highly colored.
Okay, I think this was a wonderful final word, but not yet, not yet, not yet. Those of you who have still not heard enough from our speaker, Stallings' books are presented in our museum bookstore, which remains open after this lecture. And as of now, please join me in thanking our speaker today, Alicia Stallings. Thank you all and have a wonderful evening.